So we should get going with our roundtable. So would you mind please coming over? And we have a request. It's going to be a very intimate, involved, engaged session of roundtable. So the request has been made that if you do not mind moving forward, coming over and stay close than staying that far behind, that would be very helpful for everybody. So the format of this roundtable is like this. Professor Cheney Ryan, whom I'll be introducing now, will be leading the discussion by first doing his presentation, an informal presentation, and then inviting the 5 students to comment. And it could be quite interactive. And then the whole idea is to get the audience engaged and involved in it too. And so we have given ourselves ample time for this, 2 hours from now till 5:30. So with that, let me first introduce Professor Cheney Ryan, and then our 5 brilliant students. You know, not only they're the very best students in Utah, they're the 5 best students in the country. We are very lucky to get them. No, I really mean it, and you'll get to see. You'll get to see when they open their mouth. You know. Yeah. So first, a brief introduction for Professor Cheney Ryan. Professor Cheney Ryan works with Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict, where he is engaged in a multi-year project exploring the relation of pacifism and nonviolence to contemporary just war theory. His aim is to develop the pacifist alternative in ways that are sensitive to the contemporary reality and challenges of war. Professor Ryan's most recent book is War, Sacrifice, and Personal Responsibility. That was published in 2009, I believe. Professor Ryan has taught at the University of Oregon for a long time, also at Harvard Law School and at Northwestern University, and has been a fellow of the Oxford Changing Character of War program. That's his formal introduction, but let me go a bit informal to present his other side, the more informal side, which is extremely interesting. So this time I'm going to call him Cheney. Cheney grew up in LA, in Los Angeles, where his father was a movie actor and his mother founded an elementary school, still flourishing, devoted to peace education. So that means it runs in Cheney's blood, as you can see. He first became involved in social justice movements when he attended the March on Washington in 1963. He worked in both Kentucky and Mississippi during Freedom Summer 1964. Cheney became involved with the Catholic worker movement in the late 1960s, a Catholic pacifist organization led by Dorothy Day. Cheney was expelled from Harvard College in 1970 for anti-war protests. He still has no bachelor's degree. He served a brief time in jail for draft resistance and then worked as a dishwasher. During the 1980s, Cheney took several years off from academia to work with the United Farm Workers on the West Coast, opposing pesticide use. Cheney co-founded the Oregon Humanities Center, its Peace Studies program, and its master's program in conflict resolution. Cheney's hobby, this is interesting, of course, as if the others were not. Cheney's hobby is playing the piano for cabaret groups, which he has done since college. So, with this about Cheney, let me just mention the names of our student panelists in the order they're sitting there. Gage Hansen, right here, from our S.J. Quinney College of Law. He's also a junior Carnegie Fellow here at the U. Then we have Lisa Hawkins, who also is a student here at the EU in Political Science Department. She's also involved in the student governance and also with the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Then we have Pratik Raghu from Westminster College in the honors program in philosophy and peace and conflict, and you have heard some of his brilliant questions already in some of the panels. We then have Betty Stoneman from Utah Valley University, who is in philosophy program there and also in peace and conflict studies. And Utah Valley University, as you know, is our neighbor university. Then we have Lynette Seeger there, and she's also, in fact, a Utah graduate from Westminster College, so we can claim her to be our student here in Utah. Then she went to NYU to obtain a master's program. Right now, she's enrolled in the PhD program in the Global Division of Global Studies at Rutgers University, which is headed by Jean-Marc Kwaku, who gave the opening keynote last evening. So with that note, I hand it over to Professor Cheney Ryan.
Dean insisted on those bits from my checkered past. But they actually are, most of them, not the piano playing part, relevant to what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about social movements, and I'm going to talk about peace movements in relation to other social movements. I'm really going to draw very parochially on my own experience and the experience of the United States. And we'll talk a fair amount about the civil rights movement as the kind of canonical social movement in the United States in the 20th century. I want to say, though, that it's not, I don't mean to say by any means that these are therefore models for all time of what a social movement must be. In fact, I think it's a very real question of how relevant those models are anymore for where we are. So I'm going to say things about those movements and draw conclusions from them, but obviously the open question is how much can we generalize from those cases, how much do they apply today? So this will take at most a half an hour, I hope less, and the students will talk for 10 minutes each, and then we'll talk together. Now, I think that when we talk about peacemaking, there are actually two ways we can think about the enterprise of constraining war and creating peace. One of them is the approach that involves international institutions, international diplomacy, international law. I think of this, without meaning to be judgmental, as a kind of a top-down approach or an outside-in approach. So the idea there is that countries are sort of inclined to go to war, and we create these mechanisms to constrain them. And so the discussion of this is the discussion of how do those mechanisms work, how do we more effectively constrain aggressive instincts, etc. Diplomacy, a big factor. But the other way I think that we create peace is, in some sense, from the bottom up or the inside out, which is that we create peace by creating peace movements that speak to our own countries, and they speak to the aggressive instincts of our own countries. Those are domestic movements, and I'm going to be talking about peacemaking as domestic political movements and speaking to the United States experience. Now, once again, let me say that obviously this distinction can be blurred, and one of the main ways it's been blurred in recent years is through the creation of international NGOs that have both a domestic presence and an international presence. And this is a huge change, because I think up until recent decades, making peace was conceived pretty much entirely either as something you did from the top down through international institutions or from the bottom up through peace movements, and that was kind of the story of how that happened. So maybe once again we've moved into new terrain. So one of the questions I want to do, I want to comment on peace movements and in relation to other movements, but in some ways I'll just raise questions more than make any big claims. I'll raise some questions about how these movements have functioned, some of the problems that we faced, and leave that there for us to discuss. I raise questions because I think that we very much live still in the shadow of the Iraq War. Now, I think it's sometimes hard to remember this because I think that when Barack Obama was elected, there was kind of a feeling that by doing that, the Iraq War and all that meant was left behind us. I'm not saying that happened. I think there was a kind of a feeling of we don't have to think about that anymore. And that was compounded by, obviously, the financial crisis in 2008, which shifted attention to some extent there. But we should be worried about that, because when you look at previous huge social conflicts, you oftentimes see that there's a kind of a conclusion to them and then a period of amnesia. That happened after the American Civil War catastrophically. I think that people simply wanted to forget about what that conflict was about. And for many of you who are too young to experience this, it really happened with the Vietnam War as well. It was really a while after the Vietnam War concluded that people returned to think about what that meant, et cetera. And I think we're now in a period of amnesia about the Iraq War, and I think that at some point we will return to think about what that meant for American society. One of the things it meant was that the peace movement was not able to stop it. There was a substantial opposition to the Iraq War domestically. There was a substantial amount of marches against it, huge international, I think, outpouring of concern, and it seemed to have been really something that had no effect at all. And I think one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, why did that not have the effect that we wanted? The Iraq War is truly a catastrophe. Let's remind ourselves how much it is. It cost the United States between $1.7 and $5 trillion by the time it will be concluded. To put that in perspective, the only war more expensive is World War II to the United States, which was $4 trillion. So the Iraq War is far and away the second most expensive. The entire Vietnam War only cost $800 billion. So that's one way to think about how much money the Iraq War cost. And of course, it cost about 140,000 lives, minimum estimate of Iraqis, about 7,000 lives of Americans. I think it was a truly catastrophic war. It was not just a needless war, but it was a tremendously incompetent war. And that's something that we'll need to come to terms with. If you've read Thomas Ricks' book, Fiasco, still I think the best book on it, you cannot believe the amount of incompetence that characterized this war. I think we tend now to think, well, it was Bush's problem and Bush's war. The reality was that every institution in American life contributed incompetently to this war. And that's one of the sobering things about war as an efficacious tool, which is that the most powerful war-making government in world history, with all the resources at its disposal, all the intelligence that you could gather, created an enterprise that was so incompetent. And to me, that raises questions further about the enterprise of war-making itself. Douglas Johnson was talking about his experiences in Afghanistan. When the story of the Iraq War is written, one of the things they will point out is that they were dealing with an insurgency from the beginning. It took them between 3 to 4 years to realize that they were fighting an insurgency and not a conventional warfare. That's kind of the story of the Iraq War. 3 to 4 years, by the way, is longer than the United States was fighting World War II. That's how long it took them to figure out what kind of war they were fighting. How that could have happened, the geopolitics of that is part of the story to come. We didn't stop it. The peace movement didn't stop it. Maybe nothing could have been done, but one of the things I want to pose as a problem is not the successes of the present, but in some sense the challenges. What does it mean to create a peace movement? Now, the framework that I want to present for thinking about a peace movement or social movements generally is that social movements generally have two styles. And I want to talk about these two styles and present them and actually also relate them to what we've talked about today and last night. And then I want to pose some problems about these two styles as things that you confront if you're part of a movement, if you're contributing to it, okay? I call these two styles the pragmatic and the visionary. By pragmatic, I don't mean necessarily anything related to the philosophical school of pragmatism. I simply mean, I think, what we ordinarily mean by pragmatic. And so now let me begin with a contrast between those two styles, and then I want to pose as a framework for thinking about some of the problems with social movements. The pragmatic, as its name suggests, the pragmatic approach focuses on specific bite-sized problems. The pragmatic approach is the approach which says, what can we accomplish within the existing context? I heard the pragmatic approach mentioned today when Tariq said, we start from here. We start from where we are. It's a very kind of pragmatic thing. You have to start from what you're given, with the context that you're given. I felt when Jean-Marc was talking last night about we have to think about what people really are, how they really are, their psychology. I'm hearing the pragmatic approach. We can't just dream about what people should be. We have to ask ourselves what really is their psychology, that we can deal with that. The pragmatic approach, I think, tells us that we should be above all else reasonable. It recommends itself, I think, very much to academics because they like to think of themselves as very reasonable people. And so the pragmatic approach is one that says we've got to be reasonable, we've got to be realistic, we've got to take problems that are manageable and deal with them one at a time. When David Roden was talking a little while ago about the just war tradition, the just war tradition recommends itself for being pragmatic. That is, the just war tradition often says, listen, we've got war, we're not going to do anything about it, so as long as we've got war, let's accomplish what we can. And what we can do is try and sort of contain it around the edges, but let's be pragmatic, let's not talk about doing much more than that, okay? Now, the visionary approach, and again, I hope the terms are somewhat self-explanatory. The visionary approach doesn't want to take things in their context because it wants to change the context. It basically says the problem is we need to change the whole context and we need to change the way the problems are conceived. I think the visionary approach is sometimes uncomfortable with any talk of human nature because it tends to think that human nature is something that's plastic, it's malleable, it's constituted by our ideas about ourselves, and so we should challenge those. We should not simply take facts of psychology as given. I think the visionary approach is associated with a kind of moral urgency. So the pragmatic approach says we've got to be reasonable, we've got to take our time. The visionary approach says let's get going, what are we waiting for? It's associated with a kind of sense of moral impatience. And I have to say that as a very young man, that was one of the things I found attractive about groups like the Catholic Workers. I don't know if people know this group, but they were really, we've got to, what are we waiting for? Come on, let's get going. It's very attractive to young people, I think rightly so. I think the visionary approach also aims above all else to be hopeful. But let me explain what hope means, and here I'm going to use a distinction that the philosopher Gabriel Marcel draws. He has a very interesting discussion of hope. He distinguishes hope and optimism. He says optimism is an attitude that you have on the basis of the evidence at hand. So when a doctor says to you, we're optimistic, the doctor is immediately going to say, because we have this result, we have this result, we have this result. When a doctor says, let's be hopeful, what the doctor is basically saying is, let's try to see possibilities of a type that the immediate evidence may not allow for. Notice the connection of that with not taking the context as given. Let's look for more that's there than may first present itself. And I think that the essence of the visionary approach is hopefulness. Maybe in contrast to reasonableness. I'm not sure whether those are two different things. But when Martin Luther King said the arc of the moral universe is long but it bends towards justice, he wasn't saying something based on evidence. He was saying, in some sense, an expression of hope, which he meant to act on. And I think that's another thing about hope, is it has a sense of urgency. Not only do you have an intellectual attitude towards this, but you aspire to act on it. Okay. Now, I came to this distinction. Let me just explain a little bit more by explaining how I came to it through teaching an introductory class on the philosophy of conflict resolution. And I was thinking about this because one of the things we did in conflict resolution was we talked about the issues of negotiation, mediation that both Doug and Abdul were talking about a little while ago. You know, how do you engage in mediation? Central kind of problem you begin with in conflict resolution. And I started to notice our program was based in a law school, but most of the students were not law students. And that was when I started to think that what I'm encountering here is two different styles. Some of the students were pragmatic in their iteration, and some of the students were visionary in their orientation. And the interesting thing was that that would kind of clash periodically. The pragmatists would look at the visionaries, and they would say, when they looked at a visionary, the pragmatists would think this person is just some woo-woo dreamer, head in the clouds, never going to amount to anything, you know, spinning fantasies. Okay, so let's be pragmatic. Let's talk about what's really going to work. The visionary would look at the pragmatist and say, this person is just some technocrat pedant who's stuck in the present, is never really going to change anything with these little piecemeal problems. They'll probably just generate more problems to solve piecemeal. And so these were kind of two different ways of looking at things. I would try to suggest to them that they were complementary, that we shouldn't have to choose between the pragmatic and the visionary. I came up with a pithy phrase, vision without pragmatism is empty, pragmatism without vision is blind. So we should have both. Why is it so hard to do that? Why is it so hard to join both pragmatism and vision? And that's one of the things that I want to pose for your thoughts, because on the one hand, it's like nice and easy to say we should have both. It turns out it's actually very hard to do both, and I think that it's interesting to reflect on what that tells us about these approaches. Okay. Now, when I think of a successful political movement, I think of the American Civil Rights Movement. And so what I want to do is talk about some of the things we learn about the pragmatic and the visionary there, but some of the problems that it raises. I'll mention one or two, but given the time constraint, I won't say a whole lot about it. I think that the American Civil Rights Movement was not just successful, but inspiring because it was both pragmatic and visionary. And it was its visionary dimension that was inspiring. An interesting thing about the Civil Rights Movement was how inspiring it was globally. America has had other social movements. The most important social movement in the 19th century was the abolitionist movement, and that's a movement that I've studied a lot in terms of how it worked and didn't work. But the abolitionist movement didn't inspire anyone outside of the United States because every other country had already abolished slavery at the time the abolitionist movement was trying to abolish slavery in the United States. What's distinctive about the American Civil Rights Movement is that it became, in some sense, a beacon for other movements globally, so that in 1989 you heard, you know, sort of the Civil Rights Movement alluded to as a kind of an iconic movement. So it was not just successful, it was inspiring, and that's, to me, a key fact about its having the visionary component. King was very, very good, and the civil rights leaders of the movement were very, very good at identifying particular problems to struggle against. And in particular, they were good at identifying problems pragmatically that had a larger impact. When I've talked to my students about why have a struggle around sitting in at a lunch counter, what difference does that make? We talked about all the things that eating at a lunch counter could signify. So it wasn't just desegregating a lunch counter. It was about eating together, sharing a table together. That was a successful pragmatic movement of choosing the right problems. It used to be that the peace movement had draft resistance. And one of the things about the peace movement was, I think that at a time it was vibrant because the issue of draft resistance wasn't a very successful pragmatic problem to pose for people, because it wasn't just an issue of did you go into the military. It posed all sorts of issues about what does it mean to be an autonomous agent, what are your moral principles. One of the challenges of the peace movement, I think, is that the end of the draft took away draft resistance as a movement. And to some extent ever since, I think that it's not been obvious to people what are the pragmatic problems that you confront if you believe in a domestic peace movement? What are those actual things that you confront? So there's a problem with the pragmatic approach, which is, in some sense, it's not enough to say we have to solve particular problems. You have to choose the right particular problems, and that, to me, is something for which there's no recipe. And one of the challenges that, in some sense, I would say for a peace movement today is, what are those problems and how do we find them? Okay. Now let me say something about the visionary, the issues of the visionary, and then I'll wrap it up in just a minute, okay? But maybe, I hope we can think about this distinction, save it more in discussion. Where does vision come from? In the 19th century, there was the feeling among a number of social activists, Karl Marx is an obvious example, that vision comes from theory. So that if you want vision, you engage in theory. So therefore the call for we need visions is the call for we need to do more theory, because that gives us the big picture and then we fill in the details down there. I would suggest to you that theory doesn't give us vision at all, because I don't think theory is very inspiring. But I also think that as a practical fact, it's very hard to find a political movement whose visionary component came out of some kind of theoretical exercise. Now, I think I would qualify that in a longer discussion, but I actually think that that's part of the problem, is that I think the need for vision is important, but it's really not obvious where you find it or how you get it, because it's simply not the case that you can go read a book on vision and get your vision from that. One of the reasons why I think it's problematic where it comes from is it's not even clear what it is. What does it mean to have a vision? I think, to me, it's obvious that Martin Luther King had a vision. He had a dream, actually. That's the way he would put it. But when you think about what his vision was, it was all in images and metaphors. It was really not something that he seemed to be able to cash out in any other way, and maybe that's the characteristic of vision. I was thinking of Randall's powerful talk this morning, which concluded with the image of Jane Goodall hugging the chimpanzee, and at the moment I was thinking, well, that's kind of what vision is. It's something that, it's like, if people are familiar with the Quaker image of the peaceable kingdom, which I was brought up on. The peaceable kingdom is a famous series of paintings based on the lion will lay down with the lamb. But it's just images. It's just images. It's something that's hard to articulate. But my suggestion is that a social movement has to have something like that. So where do we get it? Well, I think if you look at actual movements, most of them get it from religion. And that's why I think this concluding point about visions engages a lot of the discussion we've had about we can't ignore the religious component. We have to look at Native American traditions. We have to look at other religious traditions, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at American political movements, they have been primarily religious-based, and that's something that secular academia has trouble acknowledging. But the reality was that the abolitionist movement was run by evangelical Christians. It was joined later on by civic Republicans, but it was primarily an evangelical Christian movement. The American Civil Rights Movement was rooted in the African American churches. Even when it moved north to Malcolm X, keep in mind Malcolm X was a minister in the Nation of Islam. These are religious prophetic traditions. And as I said, I think that one of the reasons why in academia people have trouble engaging this is because there is this resistance to talk about religion, and in particular now to acknowledge that it has been as progressive a force as it is a different type of force in history. I would mention one other example. The largest mass movement in American history is the nuclear freeze movement of the 1980s. People don't think of it that way because of complications with that. But if you simply ask, what was the movement that the most people were involved in, there's no question it was the nuclear freeze movement in the 1980s. It was founded by religious institutions, and it was run by religious organizations, as was, by the way, the opposition to the Iraq War. The opposition to the Iraq War was entirely based really in mainstream churches in this country. Now, that's not an argument for why we have to be religious. It's not an argument for being religious at all. It's simply to say that if we're talking about the need for vision, we're going to have problems if we exclude or set apart those resources like religious resources or spiritual resources. There's still today, when we had the discussions of the ecological situation, I think there it's pretty straightforward that there's the appeal to religious views. Okay. How do we merge pragmatism and vision? Well, when I was talking to a friend of mine, Jim Astman, before coming over here, I told him, well, I'm going to talk about these two styles, pragmatism and vision, and the problems with them. And he said, well, you know, those are the two components you need to be a good parent. And no one's come up with a recipe for being a good parent yet, so why is anyone going to come up with a recipe for having a good social movement? Because pragmatism and vision are things which are obviously things you need and obviously things we struggle to create, and maybe they're things which we never fully succeed in that regard. I think the peace movement needs a great deal of vision now, and that's one of the reasons why I joined with David Roden in trying to look at the pacifist tradition for ways of moving beyond the just war tradition. Anti-war thinking has been pretty effective when it's been anti-war. It's been pretty good at opposing things. But we really have moved beyond that. I think the world today is really kind of convinced that war is not really the solution. But they want to ask, where do we go next? And what we can do is we can describe mechanisms, we can describe institutions. That's exactly what we should be doing. But I think we need something powerful to mobilize people, and that would be the visionary element. And I'm not sure what that is. I'm not sure where we go with it. Why is this a special problem? Well, as some of the other speakers said, we live in a global community now. If visions have come from religious traditions, we now live in a community where we have to talk across religious traditions. We now live in a global community where there's so many different sources for this, it may be extra difficult to find a single one that we can agree about. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say now, and I'm going to hand it over to our students, and hopefully we can say more about this in discussion. Thank you very much.
Hello. So we need to rethink peace building. That's fairly obvious. Peace can't be just the absence of war. We have to start thinking about what society looks like without war, and what alternatives to conflict resolution we have once we get rid of violence. The literature on war has done a wonderful job of creating this dichotomy in which the only solutions to conflict are diplomacy, whether it involves mediation or arbitration or compromise or war. That's all you get. There was once an alternative other than that, used for a good portion of human history, whether it was by Brutus and Cassius. While I'm not here to support assassination, but at some point in human history, we chose mass violence over strategic violence. We decided that strategic violence wasn't really fair in the game. And why is that? Was it because policymakers were the targets of assassination and poor people are the target of war? There was once, at one point in time, the draft, where everyone shared in the pains of war. Now, the communities where I grew up, reservations, slums, are where most soldiers come from. The critique of war has always been that violence begets violence, that the fog of war clouds humanity's ability to be humane. The critique of diplomacy has always been that individuals, nations, states will always be too stubborn in some of their actions that harm others to ever give up violent defense to what will eventually be violent offenses. I'm not exactly sure that this dichotomous world exists. There are examples in indigenous cultures in which violence is used. Instead of violence, we have alternatives. My culture used dance. That's not necessarily the best solution to your problems, but they existed. Why do we decide that certain actions are fair and certain actions are not fair? Political pacifism's argument that war is fundamentally illegitimate and there is a compelling interest to refuse participation in the action is the best way to develop constructive alternatives. The individuals who choose not to participate represent this logical critique of the war system. The war system is maybe the most important when we look at the things we're calling universal. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 3, gives us the right to life. If the right to life is a natural law, then any rejection of that right is inherently wrong. Whether it's by the grace of God or that life is the only provable truth in the entire universe, by rejecting that right, it is innately wrong. Or it's positive law, right? If the right to life is a positive law because it's in our international documents, because it's in our constitutions, then it's the recognition of the right to life that provides it with this right. And then you have the alternative to not recognize that right. But an actor's choice to not recognize the right to life of another then invalidates their own right to life. This could be a basis, I guess, for war, saying that war is just the voluntary expulsion of myself from the social contract. I choose to leave the social contract and enter the state of nature for a period of time in which my opponent does the same. But then what are we left with? We're left with people outside of the social contract. And how does the social contract govern people outside of it? The international community used that problem to develop the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention is essentially a contract of war. But that in itself is problematic. The fact that we have a war contract. Not that we saw war as a problem and sought a solution, but rather we decided that there was a better way to go about killing each other. That's problematic in so many ways. But it doesn't really provide us with a remedy. Even if we recognize that war is a voluntary action to exit the social contract, there's no remedy to that. I work in women's rights, mostly in the North Africa and the Middle East. But last summer I worked in South Africa with the Committee for Gender Equality, a South African institution, Chapter 9 institution of the South African Constitution. South Africa's government's not this pinnacle of idealism, and corruption is rampant, but the South African Constitution is fairly idealistic. And things in the three commissions put forth in the Chapter 9 of the South African Constitution are these pragmatic institutions designed to take small steps towards the idealistic goals of the South African Constitution. They are, in effect, regulatory agencies of social justice. The Committee for Gender Equality, the week I got to South Africa, said that the laws on prostitution in South Africa were discriminatory against women. South Africa's parliament then had 18 months to solve that problem. If they don't, then the committee's statement goes into effect as law. I'm not exactly sure that statement as a law itself is determinative or solves the problem, but the fact that somewhere in the world there is an agency designed to address social issues specifically based on human rights, on discrimination, on inequality, are drastically different than the constructs that we have in the United States. The world is a work in progress, and the systems that we have are not perfect. In fact, they're probably far from perfect. But using the same old systems, whether they're from 200 years ago, when the US Constitution was written, 237 or something like that now, or from 2,000 years ago, or from 5,000 years ago, the constructs of war are not going to solve problems that they haven't solved for 6,000 years for 12,000 years. So new constructs, things like the South African Committee for Gender Equality or the Human Rights Committee, maybe they're not the best solutions, maybe they're not the perfect solutions, but they're at least steps in the right direction, and constructs that put us in steps in the right direction are much better than giving up and saying we'll never reach the vision that we want. And so I suppose pragmatically, constructs that fail are better tried than constructs that have continued to fail.
I'd like to go back to Professor Ryan's ideas about pragmatism and vision and suggest that vision without pragmatism is not only ineffective but detrimental. Yesterday, Professor Ryan suggested to me the writings of Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist and peace activist. So I went home and I Googled him, and I stayed up most of the night reading his work. And Mr. Hanh writes about inner peace, or peace of mind. So at first I was really just taking in everything he said for my yoga practice this morning. But the more I thought about it and the more I read, his words started to echo a lot of what we've been discussing in preparation for this conference. Mr. Hanh talks about reuniting our body and mind. He says we often alienate the two. His exact words claim that mind and body are two manifestations of the same thing. He writes, if you take consciousness out of a cell, the cell will die. If you take consciousness away from our bodies, they will be lifeless. I would suggest that vision and pragmatism have much the same relationship. If you remove pragmatism from vision, the vision dies. If you take vision away from pragmatic action, your action is lifeless. I spent this last summer in New Delhi, India, working with an NGO called Maitri. And one of the things I got to do with Maitri was work in their tutorial center, and one of the little girls I worked most with was a girl named Mahima. And Mahima had a very severe facial deformity. And that resonated with me a lot because I have a nephew who has a cleft lip and palate. So I immediately thought a lot about how she just needed an operation. And so I asked around about it and found out that her parents would never be able to afford this operation because all of their money was saved for her dowry for however many years later. And so I immediately was really heartbroken about this and started envisioning ways in which I could get Mahima this operation. So I researched it a lot and thought I was being really productive by contacting Operation Smile, but it turns out that Operation Smile has no facility near New Delhi. So in terms of travel and her parents leaving their jobs, this wouldn't be an option for Mahima. And so I gave up on it. And since I've been home, I've thought a lot about how, as much as I envisioned Mahima being healthy and being well, I didn't take any action for it. And I thought maybe I was being pragmatic, but I wasn't fully being pragmatic. And that inspires a lot of guilt and a lot of feelings. And I've come to realize that feelings are very easy, but doing something about those feelings is very hard. Maitri India, the NGO I worked with, has this vision to eradicate violence against women in all of India, which is a huge feat and a huge vision. And they're taking pragmatic action to do so. We started on a micro level by working with women, providing legal advocacy for situations in which they'd been abused, and then offering them counseling and giving them a place to stay and escape from an abusive situation. We took it to a community level by meeting with local universities and elementary schools and high schools to do workshops about sensitivity and violence sensitivity. And then we even dipped a toe in the global waters by trying to start we did start a campaign in which people pledged never to allow violence in their lives. This was huge for me because it showed me that vision can be something tangible, and if addressed pragmatically, it can be real. While I was in India, I got to travel over to Nepal and visit the Choice Humanitarian site, started by James Mayfield, who's actually used to be a professor here at the U. And he told me this story about how his grandson had asked him what he wanted to do before he died. And he decided that what he wanted to do before he died was eradicate extreme poverty in one entire nation. Which, when I heard that, I was like, that sounds really cool and also ridiculous. However, when I visited his site and he explained to me the concept of his organization, I realized that this was becoming a reality because of the pragmatic solutions that he was finding by sending representatives out to these very rural communities and finding exactly what it was that was causing extreme poverty for them, and then finding what needed to happen to fix that problem for them. And it was very pragmatic and very personalized, and as visionary as that was, he's actually on track to eradicate that poverty in the next couple decades. That for me was really, really inspiring. But there are a lot of NGOs who do not strike the balance that Maitrey has struck or that Choice Humanitarian has struck. A friend of mine just recently got back from the Philippines, from the Tacloban area, which is absolutely devastated by this typhoon. And he says the area looks like a war zone. And considering that many of those specific areas have a 75% casualty rate, it is a lot like a war zone. And when he got there, he was like, well, what are we even doing here? Because the UN was already there, and all of these huge international organizations and really powerful visionary entities. But when he spoke with the people, which he could do because he speaks their language, which is Wale Wale, I believe that's how you pronounce it. He speaks it fluently, so he was able to speak with the people in these communities, and the UN was not able to do this. And many of these organizations did not speak this very unique dialect. But what Nate learned was that as visionary as these groups were, and as well-intentioned as they were, the people there didn't need bags of rice, and they didn't need shelters to be built for them. What they needed was the tools to build these shelters and to continue building them, and what they needed was, at the risk of being cliche, because this is literal, they needed nets to catch fish. They didn't just want someone to give them food, because that wasn't going to last. And so from listening to Nate, I realized that obviously everybody can get on board with aiding the typhoon victims. But it takes a very special skill set, like Nate's language skills, and a really analytical effort to provide practical, lasting solutions. We talk about these great visionaries like Nelson Mandela or Gandhi. And while these individuals have really beautiful ideas, and while they say powerful words, it's their pragmatism that makes them historic. Nelson Mandela, for instance, envisioned a peaceful South Africa capable of forgiving and moving forward from its past injustices. At his inaugural speech, Mandela took his first pragmatic step towards this visionary forgiveness by welcoming his prison guards and other prosecutors in the front rows of his audience for his inaugural speech. I think one of the greatest risks, especially unfortunately, in academic world, is alienating vision and pragmatism, and creating this division that's not only unnecessary, but really debilitating to our ability to advocate and enact change on any level. We've convinced ourselves that we cannot be both visionary and pragmatic, that somehow pragmatism will hurt our vision and vice versa, when really it's absolutely necessary to be both, whether it's for development or politics or global peace building. I mean, you think even about the phrase peace building, and building is a process, a very pragmatic, practical process. So my hope is that as we continue to move into the 21st century, we will champion both vision and pragmatism and allow them to be manifestations of each other.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I focus specifically on indigenous, decolonial, and post-colonial political philosophy. And for the purposes of my response to Dr. Cheney's remarks, I will be drawing upon two critical schools of thought, namely post-colonialism and critical theory, to critique both the pragmatic and visionary approaches to peace building. What I want to emphasize in the course of my response is that these are not critiques alone. They are not purely cynical, as a lot of postmodernist thought tends to be. Instead, these critical theoretical frameworks aim to reinterpret pragmatism and visionariness to democratize peace building and facilitate really meaningful change. Before I delve into my critiques themselves, I'd like to tell you a little bit about post-colonialism and critical theory, just in case you're not familiar with these schools of thought. Critical theory is rooted in Marxism to a significant extent, and it emerged in the wake of Europe and specifically Germany's horrific experiences with fascism during the Second World War. It essentially seeks to explain why ordinary people, why citizens tolerate a grossly unequal world in which a few people exploit the masses. To quote the words of one prominent critical theorist, it wants to understand how people come to love their own oppression. Moving on to postcolonialism. Postcolonialism is not a single school of thought. It is more a category of discourses. Now, these discourses are invaluably diverse as they come from many different geographical and socio-historical backgrounds, not least of all Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Something you might have noticed about the geographic areas I mentioned is that they are all part of what people in this corner of in this neck of the woods tend to think of as the third world. Now, this speaks to one of the major realities of postcolonial theory, namely that postcolonial theorists share a past and a present defined by pervasive and insidious oppression. I speak of both the past and the present because postcolonial theorists see colonialism as more than a historical phenomenon that involved the exploitative Eurocentric control of the non-Western world's resources in two phases during the last millennium. Instead, they see it as a living, breathing, oppressive force that has infiltrated the bodies, minds, and souls of subjugated peoples across the global South. As such, postcolonialism as a category of discourses aims to help subjugated peoples, primarily in the third world, reclaim identities and knowledges marginalized by the beliefs underlying first world subjugation. Now, both postcolonialism and critical theory are interdisciplinary and intersectional, drawing on and feeding into belief systems as varied as feminism, ecology, critical race theory, and queer theory, to name but a few. Now that we've taken a quick look at both postcolonialism and critical theory, let's apply these belief systems to pragmatism and visionariness. Let's begin with critical theory and pragmatism. As someone who is taking a course on critical theory this semester at Westminster College, I am tempted to see the risk of the instrumentalization of reason inherent in pragmatism, a risk that endangers necessary and large-scale radical change to the long-term end of peace building. Now, what is the instrumentalization of reason? Reason is instrumentalized when it is dedicated to the resolution of short-term problems and not to addressing larger, possibly existential questions that undermine the status quo in place, whatever that might be. I think we see the risk of the instrumentalization of reason in the approaches we choose to adopt to the tragic case of Trayvon Martin. Now, just before I delve into my analysis, I'd like to clarify two things. I strongly believe that Martin was unjustly killed and George Zimmerman was unjustly acquitted. Having said that, I think that as informed members of the general public, we should not allow ourselves to be completely seduced by the sensational particularities of the case in question. Justice has to be served, and we need to do our part to see that it is. At the same time, though, we have to consider what the case of Trayvon Martin says in a larger context about the colonized African American body and the structural racism perpetuated by various institutions of the American state. If we fail to ask these big picture questions, if we allow our reason to be instrumentalized, we are indirectly contributing to the maintenance of the racial status quo. The same can be said about just about any other status quo, be that in terms of gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, or otherwise. Let's move on to considering how postcolonialism offers a valid critique of visionariness. As a post-colonialist, or at least one in the works, a work in progress, I am concerned by the individualism and exclusivity implied by visionariness. A lot of the post-colonial theory that I've read tends to express this concern, and I think that's because many third world nations were and continue to be ruled and shaped by a handful of Western-educated elites who maintain and have maintained a neo-colonial status quo by monopolizing the power over meaning-making. They may proclaim independence from colonial powers, but the fact of the matter is that things continue as usual, that a colonial status quo is maintained in one sense or another, in many cases applying to just about every sphere of life. If these third world cases have highlighted anything, it's that top-down change has the dangerous potential to marginalize certain groups and their interests. Here we have to draw a distinction between change by a group and change for or imposed upon that group's members. In trying to think of an example to provide to illustrate this critique, I thought back to my personal encounter with former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright last year. In having a personal conversation with Madame Albright, I came to see that she believes that her femininity had been imposed by the responsibilities she was given as Secretary of State. The more I dug into this particular phenomenon on the internet, the more cases I came across of successful women having to confine to masculinist roles. I mean, Marissa Mayer can't seem to do anything that embraces her femininity without having every bloody fashion magazine in the country wonder about whether she's really a perfect 10. I gained a theoretical framework with which to assess this phenomenon when I read a powerful piece by feminist author Sandra Lee Bartke this semester called On Psychological Oppression. She argues, and I believe argues viably and sensibly, that no matter where American women turn, they are forced to meet male standards of success and value. She actually claims that American women are a hyper-colonized half people because they have never been given the chance by male-dominated society to be anything more than half a people. Now, I do not deny that many of the advocates of, say, equality in the workplace may be visionaries who genuinely want to improve the lot of American women. Nonetheless, their privileged positions in society and the difficulty women experience in redefining gender equality and thus coming up with an authentic brand of femininity inadvertently reinforce a gender unequal status quo. I've come to believe in reading a wide variety of post-colonial texts that not everyone could or should be expected to emulate Mahatma Gandhi or Dr. Martin Luther King. Everyone should have the opportunity to overcome oppression and work for peace in their own lives without striving to be extraordinary in an individualistic sense. Now that I've offered these critiques, what do these critiques say about where we go from here? What do they have to contribute to an alternative to the negative situations I've described? If I may call upon Cheney's catchphrase about vision and pragmatism, I think that post-colonialism and critical theory break down that particular catchphrase in a way that suggests an alternative. He said that vision without pragmatism is empty. As a post-colonialist and a critical theorist, I agree, and I believe that we need to call for meaningful, not mechanistic action that aligns itself with the status quo. He also said that pragmatism without vision is blind. Again, I agree with this as someone who is oriented towards post-colonialism and critical theory, and I believe that we as informed members of the general public have to advocate for a decentralized democratic approach to meaning-making so as to prevent tunnel vision. Thank you so much for listening.
So it's going to be very hard to follow up these 3 or 4, including Cheney's presentations, but what I'd like to focus on is there's been several themes that have been pronounced throughout this entire conference, equality, common values, rights, social movements. This is my humble attempt to try to incorporate these themes into the question of how to merge the visionary with the pragmatic in social movements particularly. My suggestion is that the vision itself needs to become pragmatic without losing its imagery. It needs to be defined in such a way that puts it into a pragmatic context so that people can see the vision in everyday events, the abstract that is reducible to the conceptualization in the particulars. A movement needs to expand and move beyond the oppressed class. To do so, it needs a vision, an abstract, shared, universal concept of a particular good or right that reaches across humanity. This vision, by being shared, can be seen in every person's life. If we can see how this vision relates to our existence in a system of social relations, then we can see the specific areas in these relations where this vision is being fulfilled or where it's not. From this point, we have a guide to what actions we can take in our everyday lives to make this vision a reality. The vision also needs to be defined in such a way as to de-other the oppressed group. Othering, the process of othering always occurs in oppression. It is a dehumanizing process that focuses on difference as a negation to humanity instead of focusing on difference as a positive to humanity, adding to our humanity. The vision made pragmatic shows by itself how difference is not negation. By understanding the vision, one understands the pragmatic goal. Looking at three very prominent movements in America, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movements, and the gay rights movements, these movements all share some very prominent themes in themselves. First of all, they've reached out. These movements have been able to reach outside of the oppressed class and gain support from outside the oppressed class. That should be a pragmatic goal for social movements. But the question is how, and that's by making the vision pragmatic. One way I suggest to do that is to define the vision in this abstract yet way that reaches out to pragmatic action, that lends itself to knowing pragmatically what steps need to occur. One way is perhaps to say, as human beings who share the same basic wants and needs with the rest of humanity, we have the right to the same choice of life opportunities as white, straight males without the fear of reprisals. Just from my own experience, a friend of mine once told me, this is before gay marriage in Utah, this is before anti-discrimination against gays laws occurred in Utah, and this is also before even civil unions. He told me that as a gay man, he had 1,526 less rights than a heterosexual. It was as if he told me that as a human being who shares in the same basic wants and needs with the rest of humanity, he has the right to have the same choice of life opportunities as white, straight males without fear of reprisals. That way that was presented to me automatically did two things. It showed me the vision and it showed me the pragmatic actions that I needed to take. And it was also pragmatic in itself in that it de-othered him. It de-othered him, and that is what made the vision pragmatic. It reached out to someone who was not a part of the oppressed class and brought me into the movement. And the utility of his comment was that by me understanding the vision, by understanding not just the words strung together, but understanding the concept and the particulars, he gained the support of one more person who now votes for his cause, petitions for his cause, protests for his cause, writes letters for his cause, and goes to conferences to talk about his cause. So my comments are just very short. This is just what I've been thinking about throughout the presentations, but ultimately that's my humble suggestion, is that if you define this vision in a way that reaches out pragmatically to people, the first step is to gain people into that movement. And that's the most pragmatic utility of that vision, is to bring people into the movement under a shared common value. Thank you.
So, coming to Utah for me was a very last-minute decision, and I love coming home and engaging with my mentors from Westminster and with Dean Chatterjee, but I should have known better than to tell Dean, because now he's put me to work, so do my best. So thank you for putting me on the panel, and thank you, Professor Ryan, for graciously agreeing. My comments, too, will be brief, and what I want to do is expand a little bit on what Professor Ryan has already mentioned, which is that the visionary and the pragmatic take in the project or projects of peacemaking and social justice are mutually constitutive, and that the one can't be undertaken free from consideration of the other, or all efforts at social peace and social justice will be severely undermined or fail altogether. So, to focus first on the side of, or on the issue of the pragmatists, we might say, as a pragmatist would, that the concern of justice is to deal practically with problems on a small scale, bit by bit, as they arise. However, the question that immediately emerges from that is, what is it that we must be practical towards or about? So, in other words, in order to assess the state of affairs as problematic and as needing to be addressed, to do so requires a visionary, or what I'm more going to refer to as a normative assessment, in order to process whether or not the condition, so if it's a condition of war, if it's a condition of poverty, or the conditions of gender oppression, in order to understand whether or not those are problematic. So I would contend that the better understanding we have of the normative dimensions that inform our judgments of social injustice, the better we will be at constructing and implementing practical solutions to problems as they arise, because we'll be, or at least our goal is to be, aware of the multidimensionality of the problem, and then we can address it in those terms. Okay, to turn to the side of the visionaries. So here maybe I do or maybe I don't depart slightly from the idea of visionary as being an absolutist and revolutionary movement, and rather focus on what I believe we more commonly face in political and legal theory, which informs, or again, we hope informs, how policymakers and social actors direct their efforts. So that is, I want to say a little bit about the challenges to pragmatism that perfectionism in ideology, which is visionary in nature, generates. So what I mean by that is that often theorists, and most famously in recent political theory is John Rawls, put forward an idea of social justice that claims that if we can get the institutions right, the grand scheme, so to speak, and if we can rank and prioritize the ideals that inform how we arrange our institutions, then an actual state of justice will emerge and be realized from that. This I think that we should be wary of for the following reasons. And the first is the point that I started out with, which is that just as pragmatism needs normativity, normativity needs pragmatism. It's by observing what is happening around us, what is happening in our social and political and legal systems, and by observing the lives that people live and the suffering that they endure. These are the things that prompt us to generate normative judgments about the states of affairs. So we see the two are mutually constitutive and cannot be disentangled because they're so embedded in each other, the processes of creating them. So then the second cautionary note is that though normativity helps us recognize a problem and understand it, new challenges to social justice constantly arise. And so we don't want to presume that there's a perfect ideal arrangement, whether it's an institutional arrangement or a theoretical arrangement, that can adequately or best respond to whatever the challenge is from the outset. So that would just, what I would say against visionariness as perfectionist, either in an ideal or an institutional realm. And then third and finally, I think that we should recognize that, and again, Professor Cheney had alluded to this, that even perfect arrangements have imperfect actors. So we don't want to be too committed to a system or a visionary project, because any challenges to it are then undermined immediately, right? Because we've already said from the outset that that's the way to go. So those are my comments on the distinction between the visionary and the pragmatic. And then I was prompted as everyone was giving their presentations to think a little bit about challenges to peace movements on the global level rather than within sort of state communities. And I just thought of this as I was sitting here, so don't hold me to too high a standard on it. But I was thinking of how within the global sphere, I think that there's a big recognition of human community. I think that this is in part what drives multinational or transnational NGOs to do the work that they do, is they recognize we're all human beings and we all have certain needs, and we should have access to medicines or education, et cetera, and then they go out and they try to implement that irrespective of state borders. And on the other hand, what we don't have is we don't have strong recognition of our global legal political community, which there are distinctions between recognizing the humanity in someone versus recognizing what your duties are to them in terms of political relationality. And so by recognizing one and not the other is, I think, problematic. And in this sense, maybe NGOs are a little problematic, not entirely. I just want to raise maybe a challenge to what's happening on the global level with social movements. But so NGOs as a social movement may at times undermine the project of global justice by undermining the importance of political and legal institutions. And I think that we could look at a case like Haiti, for instance, which receives huge influx of money and participation from NGOs, but it still has a very weak state and very fragile human rights protection. And so we have this emphasis on relating to the human right, but we're neglecting and ignoring the political structure of that, or of how the political structure might better promote and promote the vision for more social justice, I suppose. And then I'll just conclude with that. We might further think that this is problematic because NGOs don't hold to the same demands that institutions of governance, whether it's of a state or of a global institution or international institution. They don't have to follow demands of equitable distribution. They don't have the governance mechanisms that allow people to bring grievance and seek redress. And so those are just some thoughts that I wanted to raise for the discussion, and maybe some of our distinguished audience, David Roden and Jean-Marc Coicot and Tony Angi, will have better answers to it than I have. But so that's all. Thank you.
So, questions, comments, objections? Yeah, well, I'm sort of I'll go back and forth. So we begin with you, Francis. So.
Okay, do I need a thing? No, yes. I love the visionary, pragmatic conceptualization. I think it's tremendously useful and also very much, you're right, one needs both. So I'm absolutely with you. Where I would complain from a European point of view is the idea that it's religion which informs movements. And I just have listed some. The workers' movements in the 19th century, all effective movements, by the way. Anti-apartheid, the movement against mining, Jubilee 2000, anti-slavery, human rights movements, women's movements. I mean, the church and so on have been there, but they were not the leaders. And I think it's a mistake to think. I mean, fine if they can be the leaders for particular things, but I think it's a mistake to think that's where the vision's got to come from.
Well, that's Right. I mean, I probably can't speak about anything other than the United States and Europe, but you're right. This seems to be a feature of American politics that religion has played the role it has in social movements. It's an artifact to some extent of the inordinate impact that Quakers had in the 19th century as a community. There's a number of kind of fairly arbitrary factors, but I was simply arguing that this should be a resource that should not be discounted or ignored, because I don't know about you, but I mean, particularly in academic philosophy, you're oftentimes in contexts where religion is just totally stigmatized as the source of all evil. And to me, that's simply being, you're not looking certainly at America's own experience. We could then argue about, well, let's look at those movements further and see what role it played, et cetera, et cetera. But I agree entirely. And I would say, in the United States, the labor union, the most important movement at the end of the 19th century was the labor union movement, and that was a secular movement. The women's rights movement in the United States has been a secular movement. So it's not even the case in the United States that this has been universally true, but it was true of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was the most important movement in American history. So.
Very much to all of you. It was a terrific panel. So I think the distinction between vision and pragmatism is incredibly useful and illuminating. But I have a question which I guess is directed at those of you, I guess Cheney, Lisa, and perhaps Betty, and maybe one or two other of you who believe that there can be a convergence or a mutually supportive relationship between pragmatism and vision. So I want to just problematize that a little bit. So when you were characterizing pragmatism, Cheney, you described it very much in terms of a kind of incrementalist approach. So the visionary seeks to really transform the context. The pragmatist seeks particular small chunks of the problem that he can address. Now, strikes me that's one component of what distinguishes a pragmatist. But another central part that distinguishes the pragmatist is his willingness to compromise, right? Is to say, even if I can't reach the ultimate goal of changing the context, I can make things a little bit better. Now, if you think that that's part of pragmatism, then the relationship between pragmatism and vision becomes much more difficult and complex, right? Because when you compromise in that way, although you address part of the problem, part of the issue, you also legitimize that context to a very significant degree. So you see this very clearly, for example, in just war theory and Loac, which I guess are kind of paradigms of the pragmatic approach. So by having this kind of intermediate position which places regulations and restrictions on what you can do in war, you at the very same time legitimize the framework of warfare. And as soon as you've done that, you're in a much more problematic relationship between the pragmatic and the visionary wings of movement. So I just wondered if the three of you or anyone else who wanted to could have a go at that.
I can just comment. I don't disagree with you at all, but I guess I would worry that so sometimes if you compromise, you lose that vision, I guess. But also, is there anything, I think there's something to be said about how if you don't compromise, then you don't have anything. You don't even have something close to your vision. So yeah, you might not reach your vision, but is taking a small step, I would say it's better than taking no step at all. And that's a very gray area. And sometimes that small step leads in an opposite direction.
To say that you align with one rather than the other. So then you say we'll be pragmatic and we'll put the vision to one side.
Well, why does there have to be that division? Why do you have to choose? Or by agreeing with pragmatism, why can't you also agree with the vision?
Because on this view, the pragmatic is to say we'll achieve the lesser goal, even if by doing that, we, as it were, place the long-term, the transformative goal out of reach. I mean, it really seems at that point that you are deciding one rather than the other.
But is there any way to reach your vision if you don't take a series of actions?
Perhaps not, or it may be uncertain, right? It may be uncertain. It may be that you're dealing with probabilities. So you know that you can, I mean, you know, it's a trade-off that you find in many, many areas. I mean, you know, people who work on climate change action, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, maybe you think that the burning of all fossil fuels is really problematic. And so you have all these you know, extractive industry companies, and you know that by partnering with them, you could make things a little bit better, but you still believe that fundamentally what they're doing is really problematic. So you know that you can generate a certain amelioration of the harm, and you know, and you suppose that it's very unlikely, but not impossible, that you would be able to, you know, utterly transform it. So now it seems like you have to make a decision, right? Kind of a high probability of you know, the pragmatic approach, a high probability of a small achievement, versus the visionary, a low probability of a transformative result. But in either case, I mean, you know, the point I'm just making is that there's a tension between those two approaches that didn't seem to be recognized in the kind of visions that you were giving, saying you need both. You know, they're complementary, they support each other.
I think, just quickly to agree with you, I guess, and offer an example for what I think you're saying is a very local debate is the count my vote debate. And if you're not from here, that's been a debate to revamp our caucus system and make it a open primary rather than just a delegate primary. And we've got this big petition going, and we've got enough signatures, and we want to put it to the ballot. And today, the state legislature, the Senate passed a bill to take a small step towards that and make it just optional for parties to have an open primary. But if they don't want to, they don't have to. But now it's not a legal requirement that they have delegates. And so I think maybe in my head, that's what I'm understanding is what you're saying is they're making this compromise that is preempting the vision, or taking a small step, but really it's taking a step away from that vision. Is that? Am I understanding you a little bit? Okay.
Yeah, I could maybe jump in on that point for just a minute. I think that just goes back to what I was saying, that you don't want to be too visionary, in a sense that you don't want to have too strong of an idea of what it is you're trying to achieve and how to achieve it, because you end up being impractical, and what's the point of a perfect theory that can't be applied? And so that's, I think...
If I may just weigh in quickly, I think one of the general pitfalls of the Western intellectual canon as a whole is that it tends to be very singular in its approach to problem solving. At the same time as we need to talk about making compromises and picking battles within the journey towards a particular vision, I think we also need to talk about a plurality of visions and the different approaches that achieving different visions might require. I'm thinking specifically of the Zapatista movement at the moment. The Zapatistas have achieved their vision of establishing autonomous community in the Chiapas region of Mexico. They have not achieved their vision of decolonizing the Mexican state. However, their lives are at stake when they attempt to achieve that larger vision, and so they have to hold off on their battle towards what they see is an essential vision for their future, thereby making a wise choice.
If I can, that's a great point, David. I've really kind of loaded the case against pragmatism by associating it with incrementalism. As I think of it, they're not necessarily the same. But I don't know then whether the issue of compromise might then be an issue that might be approached both pragmatically and from a visionary point. I don't know, I'm just thinking about that. You know where this comes up? I mean, I mentioned that I teach in a dispute resolution program, and those of you who are familiar with this, and let me not talk about international dispute, talk about interpersonal disputes. Those of you who are familiar with this area probably know that issues of sexual violence are far and away the most controversial issues in terms of issues of mediation. They're very hard to mediate. And you get in this argument where some people say, well, if you have certain types of gender conflict or gender violence, there's nothing to do other than to say we need to redefine gender relations. We just need to have different relations between men and women. Well, you can see the problem here is that if someone is there talking to you about what do I do tomorrow, to say to them we need to re-envision gender relations is not wrong. It's just, what are you telling them? And that's a case where actually the kind of visionary thing of change the whole context becomes very problematic to me. But again, I'm not sure exactly why. I mean, maybe because we don't know. I mean, I like some of the remarks, Betty. I particularly like what you liked about how sort of putting the visionary in the interpersonal, you know, seeing it in front of you. Because there I would like to imagine, well, maybe I can figure out a way to sort of put that visionary point in a way with some practical advice. But I think that's right. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, that may be one of those another things where I'm not sure there's a general answer to it.
Okay. Yes, thank you for wonderful presentations. Very much enjoyed them. So how would you apply this dichotomy to the wave that started in Tunisia, spread to Libya, Egypt, Syria, now Ukraine? Sort of a two-part question, that wave, and how would you also apply it to the Occupy Wall Street movement?
We did discuss Occupy Wall Street a little bit yesterday in how it relates to, say, in the U.S., the Tea Party movement as well. Both of these movements began out of the same problem, the same fear, the same issues with government, and yet they tackled it in very different ways. The Tea Party movement chose to fragment because they lacked any particular vision. Then as they elected members of Congress, those members of Congress took their visions and the party fragmented. So now, while you have a handful of people screaming in Congress, one of our senators being one of those people, they are not very functional as a group. Occupy Wall Street, on the other hand, repeatedly refused to recognize anyone, let alone members of Congress, as members of their group. And they didn't fragment so much as never organize in the first place. At Occupy Wall Street, you saw just as many Ron Paul kill the Fed signs as you saw anti-GMO foods. It was a very odd coupling of people. And so saying that these people had a visionary among them probably is undermining the fact that they had thousands and no actual structure, no pragmatic idea as to how to accomplish any of these goals. The Tea Party had lots of pragmatic ideas on how to accomplish these goals, but no visionary to combine them into a useful organization. The Arab Spring was a little bit of all of that, in that you had a negative response to the existence of certain social and legal structures in the Middle East and North Africa. You had rejections of ideas, and yet in most of these countries, there wasn't anything tying them together. Not until after Gaddafi was taken away did you find any decision among political leaders of the opposition that we should have a united goal. So while I've worked in Libya on lustration laws and on the Article 2 recognition of Islam as the dominant religion, the state religion, there are questions as to whether or not anybody who fought against Gaddafi really stood for either of those things. And that's problematic to say that we're going to then establish a country again, whether it's one unified state or a federal state in Libya, whether it's a unified or federal state in Ukraine or anywhere. The problematic assimilation of groups that don't necessarily get along is a bigger problem than just, do we have an idea of what we want in the world?
If I could just provide a brief addendum to Gage's outstanding description of the Arab Spring. I think
A little bit nearer to the mic.
It's not. Oh,
No,
it's working again. If you view the political regimes that existed prior to the Arab Spring as essentially colonial regimes, what I think you see in the wake of the revolutions that occurred in the Middle East is a resurgence of neocolonialism. Many radical forces might have fought against the oppressive regimes that were in place there and perpetuating colonialism in a number of ways. However, because they worked with negative visionary definitions of what they wanted to achieve, the leaders of those countries, in the wake of the downfall of their oppressive predecessors, adopted a conveniently pragmatic approach to maintaining the status quo in many cases. I think that just serves to highlight how pragmatism can play into neocolonialism. A lot of the time, when a post-colonial society is struggling to find its feet, the most convenient thing for the powers that be to do is go back to the way things used to be.
Yesterday about how in a situation like this, a vision isn't just deciding that something is wrong, or a vision isn't just fighting against something, but it's replacing that something with something better or something different once it's gone. And I think that speaks to just having a complete vision, perhaps. Your vision can be grand and it can be against something, but it has to be completed with being for something else, if that makes sense.
I'm a bit scared of asking this question if I'm going to ask it right or not. The amount of, knowledge in this room is scary. So my question is, in this two extremes, if we say vision and pragmatism, my gut and my heart tells. There is gut and heart right there in the middle. Because from Betty, I hear when you deeply listen to your friend, you figured out something, right? So for me, it's really, as a layperson, I go to my gut and heart. But of course, Hitler went to his gut and heart probably, So, I'm not talking about heart being the fuzzy thing, lovey-dovey, and, it's cruel, but it's also beautiful. So the question is, I want you all, or anyone in the room, for that matter, if you want to talk about your personal take on, when you are making your own decisions, to what extent you sit down and listen to yours, and also listen to others. Really active listening, not like trying to prepare, like asking the question, but deeply listening to others' hearts and guts. And I think in my mind it really links to what Sean Mark was saying yesterday about dialogue. Does it make sense?
Anyone want to?
All right. I'll take it. Maybe because I don't use my heart that much. I rely pretty heavily on logic to come to my conclusions. And I think that maybe it's unfortunate that so many people think that reason is incapable of reaching those conclusions. That reason can lead to faith. Reason can lead to love. Reason can lead to human reactions to pain. And unfortunately, there's this, I think, especially in the United States, anti-intellectual movement that says that reason's not capable of those things. That as a secular humanist, I'm incapable of seeing pain as anything other than a problem to solve. Pain still hurts. I might not experience that in my heart as other people do, but reason still tells me that's bad and that hurts. Seeing bad things happen to even to bad people hurts, especially when I think that we can devise ways to make sure that doesn't happen. That there are both pragmatic and visionary ways to make peace possible. And so whether you approach those things through logic or through your heart or your gut or however you choose to approach them, I think it's not only possible but mandatory that people look at them in ways that seek solutions that are both solutions to the pain and solutions to the problem.
If I could just respond as well. I think you raise a really visionary perhaps maybe feeds on the emotion more than the pragmatic, and the pragmatic maybe feeds on the rational more than the emotion. But I don't think that, and this is where I'm going to be a bit pluralist, I don't think that those need to necessarily be a dichotomy. I think that they are different realms of human experience. Each one is valid as its own, in its own right, taken within the sphere of its own set of conditions. And I think where you run into problems is when you start trying to intermix the two too much. But that doesn't mean that they can't both legitimize each other. You don't want to start using your emotion to start deciding your reason, but you don't want to, but at the same time, you can start maybe taking it in its own sphere, and maybe they can work together. Maybe not intermingle, but work together. And perhaps maybe that's where the vision and the pragmatic can exist, is not so much as confusing each other, so much as just helping each other out. I hope that answered your question. I hope that. Okay.
If I may provide a brief personal response to your question, I will admit that I tend to be a pragmatist in the heat of the moment, like a lot of people. However, I think I have built a vision for myself by establishing retrospective precedents. A lot of the time, I look at my application of pragmatism to particular situations and consider the ethical failures for which I was responsible in those moments. I try not to define that vision negatively, in that I seek to go beyond those failures to determine what could have turned them into successes as far as my vision is concerned. I think that negative definitions don't have to be an end unto themselves. They can lead to a larger vision that can prove useful in various spheres of our lives.
Let me just also comment on it. It's a great question, and I actually I thought a lot about Jean-Marc's talk last night, thinking about the talk today, and because I wanted desperately to sort of weave in those themes, but I had even less interesting to say about that than I did some of these other things, so I didn't do it. Let me say, though, one thing I have thought of that has to do with emotion. I think that a lot of political movements are driven by love and anger together. And I think that oftentimes when I think about another thing I've written about political movements, about sort of, how they can kind of go wrong too much one way or the other, is that I think movements can have actually too much love, or they can have too much anger. Whenever we talk about people just, rising up and saying no, I think we're talking about a kind of an emotion of anger. And Kant, said that justice was just anger concretized. And I always thought that was kind of an interesting thing, because Kant, what Kant's basically saying is, I'm angry because I'm not getting my rights. And you should be angry about that. I'm being violated. I want my rights. So there's anger. Now, here's the problem, and here's the issue, though, that is raised, is we worry about anger, because anger can be very toxic. And I've been involved in movements which were destroyed by the amount of anger. And I worry about the role of anger in politics. Now, there's two different positions here, and once again, I'm not going to take a stand on it. I just think they're interesting. Liz mentioned Thich Nhat Hanh, who's someone that I don't know if people know him. He's really a fabulous writer and a Vietnamese peace activist. He says in his book, Inner Being, that we should do away with anger. And it's kind of similar to what Jean-Marc was saying last night, I felt, was that we need to be at peace with ourselves. And only if we really begin by doing away with all of our anger can we really achieve peace. Now, that's a very interesting view. First of all, I'm not sure I could live it. But second of all, I'm not sure I agree with it. Because it seems to me that anger is a legitimate emotion. But to me, that's why we need vision. Because when I think of the movements I've been involved in where we just had too much anger, I think they lost a sense of vision. They lost a sense of of the higher thing that they were trying to do, and so it became hatred. What we don't want is hatred. We want to prevent anger from becoming hatred. So to me, the issue is maybe vision does that. And I think the relationship, I mean, the remark earlier about pragmatism and rationality, that sounds to me kind of right, but I'd want to talk about that more too. I mean, I know that the people who are pragmatic, and members of my family periodically say, oh, come on, Cheney, you know, dial it in, you know, and it's usually with a sense of be more rational about this, and I think that's probably right. But I wouldn't want to. I mean, a number of the people on the panel said, let's not pose false dichotomies, right? Let's not oppose reason and emotion. Let's not do that. So I would worry about that too. That's a fabulous issue. Yeah, we'll go back over here.
I would like to comment on that issue of anger to start with, and then I would like to get into some of the other issues going on, but I'll be quick. Anger or rage by itself could be quite useful as long as we don't stop there, but just go from there with certain vision. Catherine McKinnon once famously said about women, and that goes with something that Pratik said that resonates with that. She said that to be a woman and to be aware is to be in a constant state of rage. Now, that is a good point, starting point. Surely, otherwise you will never not even know that we're enslaved in half of the time, that we're not a full person. But of course, if you stay there, then you are simply destroying yourself, so you have to go from there. That's where vision comes in. So in that context, let me just make this other point, which is that I also grew up during the civil rights movement on the wild West Coast at that time. And Robert Kennedy's line inspired me a lot, which we call the politics of the impossible, which is the politics of hope rather than optimism, as we talked about. The politics of the impossible, and this is how Robert Kennedy put it. He said that most people see things as they are and ask why. I dream of things that never will be and ask why not. That's the politics of the impossible. But if we just stay stuck there, then we don't go anywhere. We have to also see how that can be practicable. That's where also the other politics comes in, the democratic politics, which is the democratic politics is the art of compromise. You know, so in that sense, I tend to disagree a bit with David that compromising or incrementalism by themselves need not be that bad or is not that negative, provided what we're doing with it and where we're going with that, you know, because often to be practical, to put some ideal and vision into practice, we have to go in a certain way. That could be one of the ways to go, and I don't see any problem with democratic procedure. Question is that it's the right type of democracy and the right sort of vision. So, well, it's a wonderful panel, no question. I know I'm not offering anything new, but I had to just leave that comment there.
The problem, and again, you know, so much of this is just talking from one's own experiences, and I think that's fine. I mean, I think we should begin where we are, and that's where we are. You know, the problem with all this, I'm not sure that. First of all, I'm not sure David was saying we should always compromise. I'm not sure that's not what I heard him saying. But the problem is that for someone of my generation, the civil rights movement came about because there had been compromise. American apartheid or segregation just was a product of compromise. Slavery was a product of compromise. That's how slavery got into the Constitution, was through a grand compromise. And then there was a grand compromise between, you know, with the former Confederacy to keep segregation. And I don't know what to say about that. I mean, I think that, so yes, compromise is something that we do, but what do we want to say? We don't do it at the expense of other people. Maybe we can do it at our own expense, but compromise at someone else's expense seems to me something that is very problematic. You know.
Dean, if I may respond to your first remark about Catherine McKinnon's rage, you might be interested to know that the feminist author I mentioned during my response, Sandra Lee Bartke, actually drew upon the work of post-colonial theorist Frantz Fanon in making her argument about the psychological oppression of women. She drew specifically upon one of Fanon's essays called The Fact of Blackness. I read that essay recently, and it's this haunting piece that just tears at your heart all the way through, and it's one I strongly encourage everyone in this room to read. A few quotations from that piece stick out to me in the context of your question. Fanon speaks of being surrounded by an all-encompassing whiteness that burns him as a black man. Towards the end of the essay, he says, he speaks of himself in the third person, saying, when surrounded by that burning whiteness, the black man has no choice but to explode, i.e. rage is the natural reaction to oppression on that level. I suppose the question then is, what are we supposed to do as members of the informed public to address oppression that extensive? Now, this might be a useful point at which to bring critical theory into the picture. A number of critical theorists would say that as members of a privileged class attending a conference on topics of this nature, we can only truly empathize with oppressed peoples like Fanon's proverbial black man if we commit class, gender, and or racial suicide. I mean, those aren't really viable options for any of us. But then the question is, what are we supposed to do instead of committing suicide for the sake of attaining true empathy? Critical theorists argue that we are supposed to be truly and sincerely sympathetic to the causes for which oppressed peoples fight.
There was you had a hand up a little while ago, so, and then we'll go back over here. He had his hand up, though.
Well, this is just a short comment, but I believe it was Martin Luther King who said, if you have a movement without concrete demands, you're wasting your time. And I think that's about as good as it gets for uniting vision and pragmatism, as well as for dealing with the emotions of vision and the logic of an outcome.
Okay. First of all, a brilliant panel, especially privileged and proud to have one of my current students on it, Lisa. Great job. Professor Ryan, you puzzled me a little bit, I think, early in your talk when I think you were basically saying or commenting on the demise or diminution of social protest movements. Did I hear that correctly? Yeah. And, I see, the technological infrastructure around social networks as being an enabler of those kinds of movements. And I wonder if you have any thoughts or comments on that, or anyone, especially in the context of some of the, I guess the Middle Eastern movements that have flared up.
I have almost nothing intelligent to say about that. I'm convinced that this is a generational gap that I will never understand, and that's why I'll defer to the younger crowd in just a moment. Let me say, I mean, what I no, I'm not ashamed of who I am. I mean, this was concretized for me that if you told me that an African American named Barack Obama would be elected president of the United States, I would have said, "Come on." And my son just took this as an example of my complete cluelessness, and he said, that shows you have no idea who young people are. He seemed to think it had a lot to do with my not understanding rap music, that this had been responsible for. That's all possible, because listen, I can't explain it. I was interested particularly, though, and as I said in the beginning, my concern about the effectiveness of peace movements, in particular in dealing with the problems in my own country. I think it's really the fact that the Iraq War happened and that there was no, now the argument is, well, it was 9/11 had occurred a year before, and it was a political climate where it was fairly, people, were upset about that or something like that. I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether that goes far enough. Now, I'm sure, though, that had there been a more effective movement, it probably would have used social media of the time available, and maybe the fact that it didn't was why it didn't succeed. So that's quite possible. I was just commenting on that.
I think that that your question ties in very nicely to the earlier question that was asked about the Arab Spring. In many, according to many political commentators, the Arab Spring can also be recognized as the Facebook revolution. Now, if we look at the Arab Spring and at a number of other social movements at large in the world today, I think you'll see collaboration and confrontation between the forces of pragmatism and vision. On the one hand, social media social media constitutes a very powerful pragmatic tool for activists seeking to rally people for their cause. On the other hand, that pragmatism may strike a contrast with the vision of some of the corporate forces and other forces behind those social media. I mean, Facebook is a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and if its recent business ventures are to be believed, then it is going to put its interests before the interests of its users in a number of contexts. I mean, I think China is an extreme example of how social media can be used to oppress rather than liberate. The Chinese government has come up with its own social media forms for its population to use to extend its oppression and manipulation of their interests and beliefs even more than it already does. I suppose we just have to wait to see how those two often conflicting forces play out.
I think
sorry, go ahead, Lisa. Okay. Just to add a little bit, sorry.
No, go.
I'll be really brief. I think the benefits of social media is that it's so quick and easy. You can reach lots of people really easy, really quick, and that can get lots of people involved. But the downside of that is that what are they doing after they sign that petition on Facebook? Are they going out and they protesting? Are they writing their senators? Probably not. It's so quick and easy that that's what they do, and they feel good about what they did to voice their opinion about whatever injustice they see. But I don't see them going out and actually doing more, except in situations like the Arab Spring. They use that as a platform to jump out and do more. But in America, I just don't really see that happening so much. It's working in the Ukraine too. But I think maybe there's another cultural dimension that has to be accounted for to see how effective that social media really is. And in America, I think maybe we are so placated. I don't know if that's the right word, but I don't think you can just say social media is the panacea for social movements. I think there's other underlying cultural factors that have to be looked at as well.
I think recently I have had the opportunity and also maybe the misfortune to lead the student lobbying efforts up at the Utah State Capitol. And I'll see a lot of my peers posting these very bold political statements about taking action and their position on certain issues on Facebook, and I'll contact them and say, hey, I'm going tomorrow to listen to that bill being read. Do you want to come? And they'll be like, no, don't have time for that. And so I think exactly what Betty was saying, it's easy to post things on social media and it's much harder to take action on them. And just another note about that is that things move really quickly on the internet. I mean, quicker even than I can really conceptualize. And when that happens, it's like you start this movement and all of a sudden there's 1 million people involved and you're like, I wasn't really ready for that yet. And then where do you go from there? And you're like 10 steps ahead of where you wanted to be because of this great internet movement.
We have
exactly.
Yeah.
Coney is a really good example.
We have the problem that all of this is generally called slacktivism. That the ability to pretend like you're an activist is paramount. The difference, I think, is so I worked at the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center. A lot of the intelligence that we got, a lot of the evidence that we got to hold Iran accountable for its human rights violations came out of Twitter, because you can text information out to the world. We have the Great Firewall of China, and Iran has its own internet, but you can't shut down your mobile service. And Twitter is an incredibly useful tool for human rights work in the world. At the same time, I sort of disagree with the rest of the panel. I don't think Americans are that way. We just do it differently. We have Anonymous, which is maybe one of the most fascinating social justice movements that's ever graced the planet. Anonymous, this group of hackers around the world who find injustice and then attack. Now, sometimes they do it kind of screwed up, and they're not always the most informed about the things that they're doing, but it's the first time that we have a group that you might call Robin Hood-esque in a very, very long time. And I don't think social justice or social movements have diminished. They're just different. And because we live in a digital world, millennials look at the world in a digital way. And changing it doesn't mean standing on street corners with picket signs. It means picketing the internet. And maybe that's not as effective in Congress, but that's because we're not in Congress yet. You still are. And that's not helpful for us.
One quick final thought on that, and maybe in the interest of getting Professor Ryan hooked on social media. In a way, social media creates a database of like-minded people from which then the organizers can go and essentially use it as a, direct mail campaign in the old political terms. And we all know the response rates are very low in direct mail, right? They're 3 or 4 or 5%. Nevertheless, Barack Obama, he won a presidency because of that very technique. So I don't think we should, just ignore the power of being able to get this database of people who share something in terms of whatever movement it is that you're trying to promote.
I wasn't at all suggesting, just the opposite. I mean, I was just simply claiming that I don't really, it's not my world. Yeah, but I would say, here's my problem with this, is that the issue, I understand the value of social media in getting the word out. And I understand the value of social media of getting information quickly out and in, okay? But my question simply has to do with, but what changes us as individuals that makes us committed to something that we weren't committed to before? And the problem is, and this goes back to some of the remarks of the panelists about interpersonal encounter and actually dialogue with someone. When I think about that in my life, it was actually firsthand experiences, usually one conversation with somebody, but it had to be face-to-face. And I've noticed this because when I was still at the University of Oregon, I taught a class on restorative justice, on criminal justice and restorative justice. And the single most impactful thing we did was take students into the death chamber at Oregon State Penitentiary. You could do it. You can walk in there. First of all, no description of it has the impact of being there. No picture of it has the impact of being there. And it's interesting how transformative that was for people. And in ways that it's even hard to kind of characterize, well, what did they know after that they didn't know before? But when I think about my own, the experiences, they're usually very first-hand experiences that kind of radically change me. And that's always, I guess, why the issue of social media is wondering whether that element is there or whether it's something that you then make use of after you've had after you've assumed that kind of commitment. That would be the only question I'd have about it. How much time do we have?
Well, you should wrap it up now, then Tom is going to say.
Well, let me, I guess we should probably, let me say again how much we're indebted to Dean and Tom and to everyone here. I had just gotten to England and turned around and flew back to Utah, and I have to say it's been fabulous. I mean, I knew it would be good, but it's really been fabulous, and it's been really a wonderful event, and congratulations. It really has been extraordinary. Thank you.